James, senior National Party figures led by Barnaby, Joyce and Bridget McKenzie have warned Scott Morrison that agriculture, mining and manufacturing must be protected in any Australian policy designed to get us to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And they will cross the floor to protect regional Australia. Now, we've heard earlier from Kieran and Andrew that maybe agriculture is being ring-fenced in the same way that it is in New Zealand. James, your take on it?
Yeah, well, it does sound like from what Andrew Clennell was saying just before the show that Scott Morrison is prepared to exclude agriculture. Now, that will give the Morrison government, I think, a big advantage when they start campaigning against Labour, which I suspect will not want that sort of ring fencing. But there's a bigger point here, which everybody should also remember. You know, all of this talk about going to 2050 net zero emissions, well, that's great, but China has said they're not going to hit net zero emissions to 2060. So that's 10 years for the world's largest economy to get even bigger while we put this handbrake on our economy, and other nations do the same thing. So, you know, we can talk about the local policy of what industries are in, what industries are out, who gets what credit or not, but we compete on a global stage. You know, we're not just competing with one another, although it kind of feels like that sometimes in these coronavirus times. But China will be stealing a complete march on our economy and everyone else in the world with those 10 years to allow itself to continue to use coal, to continue to use cheap fossil fuels to get ahead. So I mean, great politically for the next election, but I don't think that this is really an effective policy for Australia if we're not doing the same thing as the biggest emitter on the planet.
Yeah, well, we're completely insane. You're absolutely right, James, that we are completely bonkers. It's one of the coldest winters, Northern European winters we've seen. We've had a pretty cool summer for most of here in Australia, yet our politicians, they've got their heads in the sand, have they, down at the beach? Why don't they look out the window? Haven't they noticed that all these plans to get to this or that, 2050, all these plans can only ever compromise Australian industry, Australian farmers. New Zealand's been rorting the system for years. New Zealand only basically has one industry, and that's sheep. Farting sheep create more bloody emissions than anything else. And so they've gone, oh, we're going to exclude our farting sheep from our Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, as you said, James, over in China, there they are. Oh, well, our big thing is hundreds and hundreds of coal-fired plants, powered plants that we're busy building. So let's just put them to one side. And in 2030, when we built literally probably 1,000 or so coal-fired power stations, at that point, we will then turn around and go, OK, no more emissions. Australia is being played for mugs.
Well, Rowan, the bigger point, too, is that none of this solves two immediate problems that Australia has. Number one, we have incredibly high power prices for a developed nation. When we used to have some of the cheapest power prices in the world, none of this is going to do anything to bring down power prices. That means this summer it is more expensive to cool your house, even though it hasn't been a particularly hot summer.
Open the window.
Over the winter, it will be much more expensive to heat your house.
That's a serious one.
This hits pensioners especially hard. This hits poor people especially hard. So there's that whole bill poverty thing, but also industry is hit by this too, because we know for a fact, and people have been coming out and saying that the big aluminum smelters, the big heavy industry, cannot rely on the green power alternatives that they're talking about bringing in. A, they're too expensive, but B, if the power goes out, you know, you can't rely on a battery to keep your aluminium smelter going because the whole thing will seize up and cost you millions. So these two problems, neither of these are addressed by what Morrison has done here, just in terms of excluding agriculture, which is nice and that's fine. But you've got a much bigger problem here with Australian competitiveness and Australian consumer demand.